What's up, everybody? Welcome to your latest installment of Nuclear Barbarians. It is I, your nuclear barbarian, Emmett Penny, and I am here with my good friend James. I've just realized I did this to Mark Heineman. I'm doing this to you. I have agonized for probably since the first time we appeared on Decouple together, how exactly I'm supposed to pronounce your last name.
Fleay. It's
Fleay. Okay.
fair point though. You'd be the first person to get it right from the standing start. So Fleay.
I was like, this could really go either way for me. So you are here at listener request. I've been asked several times about what's up with nuclear in Australia, and I was like, well, I know just the guy to get on. But before we get into all that, I'd like to ask you a little bit about yourself so that people know that you're the guy to listen to about this. So what's your background? How did you come to nuclear, and what's your experience thus far?
Yeah, sure. The really quick version is I'm an electrical engineer, worked in the power sector. I've been an electrical engineer practicing for nearly 17 years. Worked in the power sector before moving into upstream oil and gas. So spent power generation and still work in the upstream oil and gas sector. Also worked in the solar sector for quite a few years. I really had a strong conviction that, put us on a stable, environmental, ecological trajectory that we needed to pursue wind and solar. I felt that deeply. Of course, when you really start to try and develop your own project, as we did, and you're running cash flow models and you're doing the estimates, it becomes apparent how reliant those investments are upon subsidies. And it also becomes apparent how much you need takeoff for the energy that you sell from wind and solar that is price stable, let's say, to underwrite the investment. And we didn't have that at the time in Australia. What we had is power prices collapse in the middle of the day when all the solar is on. So we couldn't make a solar project stack up. And that for me started me out on a pretty significant deep dive. I look back actually a little bit self-consciously and think, well, how as an electrical engineer who'd been working in the industry did it take me so long to realize that there was this sort of fairly glaring deficiency with the intermittency of solar and wind? But anyway, anyone who's gone down that rabbit hole and cares about the environment, cares about the future of the place that they live, the economic future, the industrial future, good jobs, that sort of thing, we'll wind up really sort of coming to the conclusion that nuclear has to be part of the energy mix. And so nearly 4 years ago, I founded Down Under Nuclear Energy, along with some colleagues in the upstream oil and gas sector, to look at what would it take to bring, from an economic perspective, to bring nuclear energy to Australia. That was a pretty naive undertaking, but we've learned a lot. And what we've sort of discovered is it's not really a question of economics in Australia. It's a question of politics, and it's a question of culture. It's a question of public perceptions. And so that's where we're trying to focus our time, or we have been sort of for the last 18 months.
So I think that's really fascinating. So you're the second person I've had on from the ONG world. The other one's Mark Heineman, who runs a small fracking firm out in Colorado. And you're the second guy who I've had who has tried to make the renewables thing happen and then been quickly disabused of it. Brian Gitt was the first one. And I mean, I, of course, was also committed to the extent that I was committed to anything to renewables and thought that was the way, the truth, and the light, which is just to say that it's powerful that people can change their minds and that we have lived that. I think that is something that sometimes nuclear advocacy can get a little bit doomerish because the obstacles feel so high, but just remembering that we ourselves changed our minds is, I think, huge.
Yeah, I mean, you have to, it takes a bit to change your mind. And in my case, it was the numbers and the reality of what we were trying to achieve in the utility scale solar space did not stack up, and I realized they would never stack up, to be a really sort of significant component of the energy system. It's not to say they don't have a role to play. They do, and you and I have mutual friends who I would say are nuclear maximalists. I would caution them to say that don't dismiss the role that solar and wind can play, but it's a comparatively modest role, in my view.
Yeah, I think, yeah. And Okay, so you said a bunch of interesting things that I want to kind of go through, and maybe we can sort of take them in order. And the first one you said is that for Australia, the issue is not economic, which I take also to mean that it's not even necessarily an industrial hurdle to clear. Obviously, there will be needs for human capital. Obviously, there will need to be some infrastructural competence and construction accomplished, but why isn't that a hurdle? I think that's a surprising thing to say.
Yeah. So it's a good point. And when we were texting about this, I think you said in the text, why can't Australia build nuclear? And my first response was to go, well, Australia can build nuclear, as
Yeah,
a matter of
yeah.
fact.
You filthy Yank.
um, so maybe we can very quickly talk about why Australia
Yeah, that'd be
does have the
great.
capacity to build nuclear, but then why we choose not to.
Definitely.
So, at the end of World War II, we had a pretty, I would say, industrially small and not very capable economy. Mind you, it was still punching well above its weight for its size, but big industrial projects were something we hadn't done before. We then had the Snowy Mountains scheme, which brought skilled labour from all over the world, particularly Europe, after the end of World War II, and that was an immense hydroelectric project, an irrigation project, and that was sort of, I would say, when Australia started to discover it started to become a little bit more confident in these undertakings. And then between let's say that period and about the year 2000, maybe the mid 2000s, we built dozens of large coal-fired power stations, refineries, LNG plants, petrochemical facilities, large pipeline systems, you name it. Okay, so the engineering and the project management and the supply chain skills required to build a large complex industrial facility are very present in Australia. We've got a lot of experience doing it, and we can do it. Nuclear would not be stretching us in that regard. Now, it's true to say that we don't have a large civilian nuclear workforce, but that's not the same as having no nuclear.
And you guys have medical
workforce.
isotopes too, right?
Yeah, correct. So in Sydney, pretty close to the middle of Sydney, actually, a little bit south, but there is a very well-run, hard-working medical isotope and scientific reactor, and we've had, this is the third reactor Australia's had. The workforce there is very competent. They're very, I would say, connected with their international peers, United States, Europe, Canada. We have a regulator that's been regulating not just the upstream part of the fuel cycle in uranium mining, but also the waste disposition and that sort of thing for the Australian Nuclear Science Technology Organisation. So we have a regulatory body. From a standing start, if you surveyed the non-civilian nuclear countries around the world and said, which one is capable of moving fastest and most competently towards a nuclear program, Australia would have to be up there. We've signed
you'd have to
all
be
the
at least in
relevant,
the running. Yeah.
absolutely. We've signed all the relevant international safeguarding treaties, non-proliferation treaties. We're a member of the IAEA. We're on the Gen 4 forum. So
You're buying
it's not a
nuclear
big
submarines,
I mean, the nuclear submarines is an interesting one. That was a fairly momentous decision, but it was the political spin that sort of accompanied that was, well, because they don't need to be refueled for 30 years, we don't have to have a civilian nuclear capability to deal with refueling and deal with that sort of,
that's interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah, so that was how the subs got bipartisan support. The reality is most people I've spoken to, both in Australia that are sort of close to that submarine program, not directly involved, but close to it, as well as internationally, is not that position is not tenable. It's not sustainable, and we will have to develop some sort of nuclear, civilian nuclear scientific workforce, industrial workforce here.
Yeah.
So Australia can build nuclear if it so chooses. It just chooses not to, and that's probably a bit more of a more relevant question.
Yeah, so then let's get right into it. You intimated that it was part cultural, part public perception. I can guess at the public perception elements of it without much difficulty, though I'm sure that there are some unique specifics. So what's the cultural hurdle here? What is the barrier?
Well, maybe we could start with what's the legal barrier and then look at the environment in which the legal barrier came about in. And here I'm talking about in federal law, not state law. There are some state bans as well. So, and I just also want to call out Dane Ackerman, formerly of Bright New World. He's done an extraordinary job of documenting the kind of really, I would say, sleazy, rather embarrassing way that Australia's anti-nuclear legislation crept into being. Back in 1998. Basically there was legislation before Parliament to combine two regulators. So we had two separate nuclear regulators doing different parts of the fuel cycle, bring them together, and they were going to be the sole regulator that would regulate the new reactor that we were planning to build, which has since been built in Lucas Heights. Pretty mundane stuff. There's stuff that lawmakers should be able to agree on and move forward, right? Anyway, it passed the lower house and was in the Senate. And in the Senate, and again, I'm not going to provide you with the link so the viewers can go and read Dane Ackerman's excellent article. Essentially, when there were 10 senators out of 76 sitting senators, I think is the number, present there, late one night, a clause was inserted to basically keep the Australian Greens and the Australian Democrats on side with other big picture legislation that was happening at the time. Now, the current Prime Minister, John Howard, was his first term. He had this big economic policy of goods and services tax, I think value-added tax, they call it in other parts of the world. He wanted to get it legislated. He needed their agreement because he didn't have a majority in the upper house. And there was basically a deal done to say, well, we're going to put this ban prohibiting any development of a civilian nuclear fuel cycle, including power stations, in this environmental clause, in this legislation that has nothing to do with nuclear power. Frankly, it's got to do with regulating a scientific reactor. But in return, we will endorse your goods and services tax reform. So it happened. It got put in there, and the context at the time, I'm the first to criticise politicians, present and historical, but Australia had very cheap power prices, cheapest in the world at that time. It's one of the few reasons we could competitively manufacture things in Australia back then. So we didn't need nuclear. We had vast amounts of coal. Carbon emissions, no one was talking about carbon emissions in 1998.
No, and it's like
the Greens weren't talking about carbon emissions in 1998 in Australia.
Right. And if you're not going to be cheaper than coal, don't bother, right? Like that's one of the lessons,
Yeah, it's we didn't need nuclear in that environment. The other thing as well, when we can talk about, there's sort of Australian anti-nuclear sentiment has a pretty long tradition within, I would say, the political left. But there was a reasonably broad Australian anti-nuclear position at that time, because the French had been conducting nuclear weapons testing in the South Pacific, and that was getting a lot of publicity. And it's impossible to unpick civilian nuclear energy from military nuclear applications for people who kind of watch the news to get their information, right? Like they don't disassociate the two.
No, I mean, that's why Atoms for Peace was created here, because Eisenhower was like, we have to really make people realize that it's not just bombs,
Absolutely. And that was an extraordinary insight that he and the people around him had. We didn't have anything like that here. And so there was broadly the Australian public not wild about the idea of nuclear. So no political loss, right? But that's why we made a decision to enshrine it in law to not build nuclear power. Now that law can be changed very simply. Laws are changed all the time. So why don't we change it? Well, there's a lot of reasons we don't change it. We do have a need for nuclear energy in this country now. It's contested. A lot of people will say we can get there with solar, wind, batteries, and maybe a little bit of gas. I think there's a significant body of evidence that casts, significant doubt on that as a viable solution in its own right.
Mhm.
But there's a bigger reason that the political class in the country won't, let's say, grasp the nettle and remove that legislation, is that there's not a good reason for them to do so. What I mean by that is, if you're going to spend political capital on convincing a population that it's a good idea to remove a nuclear energy ban, you want to make damn sure that someone from the private sector is going to come in and build a nuclear power station.
Yep.
Spend the money in your economy,
Mm-hmm.
build up, the industrial capability and complexity, and start a new industry, right? Then you would sort of go, yeah, sure, we can spend the political capital because there's going to be some real electoral during the development. It's not obvious that, in fact, I can tell you unequivocally, there is no private sector actor of scale who is looking at the Australian wholesale electricity market, the NEM, we call it, and saying, yeah, I really want to do a nuclear project in that regulatory and market environment.
I would love to compete in that. That sounds great.
Exactly right. Exactly. So the politicians are in a bit of a difficult situation where they're just saying, there's no credible proponent. It's not worth us spending the political capital. End of story. So that's one aspect. And until there is a credible proponent who's prepared to start putting some money down to explore the form and the conditions under which a nuclear program in Australia could be successful with a public-private partnership, I just don't think they're going to be that interested. So that's one aspect. Another aspect is, you look at Australia since the end of World War II, and you look at the prime ministers we've had, and Australia's been blessed. I wouldn't say we've had politicians that would, set the world on fire in a positive sense, but we have been largely blessed with competence, and that. So we ought not to complain too much. But if you look at the 16 prime ministers we've had since the end of World War II, all 13 of them come from a legal or an economics background. Okay. The exceptions are Kevin Rudd, who was a reasonably recent prime minister, who was, I would say, an intellectual technocrat, very deep knowledge on China and some other areas, not really any knowledge or first-hand experience of industry or industrial technology, farmer. And then of course the prime minister who kicked off the Snowy Mountains scheme at the end of World War II, Ben Chifley, who was a train driver, and he was probably, I would say, our last prime minister with a coherent industrial policy that was informed by his first-hand experience as a train driver in the rail system. So since then, we've had political leaders that hear the term economic complexity and vaguely understand that it's a good thing, but really to them it's just some sort of archaic economic metric, right? They wouldn't understand it if they saw it in many instances. It's not to say they're incompetent or bad people, they're not, right. But people who have worked in heavy industry and technology, manufacturing, they know what economic complexity means, is because they've seen it from the shop floor. And I think in the United States, for example, probably in Europe, there's a very rich industrial and engineering history. So these things are valued, they're seen as having merit and in their own right. Whereas in Australia, we have a very economically dry polity that basically says, this is the first and last question that's asked, do the economics stack up? And it's a very sort of shallow application of economic understanding to, do the economics stack up, yes or no? And, on that basis, it's difficult to make the case. It's difficult to make the case for nuclear in a sort of half an hour pitch.
I completely agree. I actually think that things have changed in the US since probably around the energy crisis of the 70s, especially with offshoring and things like that, to really damage not just the physical aspects of economic complexity here, but also the regard for economic complexity. I have a few out of print books from the 80s that were all panicked about offshoring and deindustrialization. And they all have titles like Manufacturing Matters and things like that, and they make these cases very forcefully that if you lose these things, you lose more than you can even count. Like once
that
it's
is
gone,
absolutely true.
once it's gone, to recover it is a project no one's really been successful at. And I mean, there's the famous quote from somebody, I think, in George H.W. Bush's staff, who said, you know, well, it doesn't matter whether you're selling microchips or potato chips as long as they sell. And I think the real gut check for that was COVID. And I think we're having another one right now with the energy crisis over the world. So let me ask you this. First off, maybe we should clarify terms. I think you and I have a mutual understanding of what we mean when we say economic complexity. But for listeners that might be coming to these things for the first time, how would you describe what that means?
That is a good question. For me, economic complexity means a society and an economy that is capable of doing lots of different diverse things. It is capable, it is able to give rise to a class of people, both professionals and skilled craftsmen, who are capable of maintaining complex mental abstractions in their head, understanding complex processes and chains of processes to create valuable outputs, and then building upon that in a way that develops economic complexity and human knowledge further. Mm-hmm. It means being able to do lots of stuff and do it pretty well. Mm-hmm. So that's not a textbook version, but
sure. I think that's a good walk in your back pocket.
Roughly what it means, I think, to me. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So here's my.
So Germany would be an example of, and the United States, I mean, as well.
We still
Germany
make
would be a good example of. Yeah. Still make plenty of things in the United States. In Australia, we used to make cars. We were one of the, I think it's down to about nine or 10 countries in the world that had a completely self-sufficient domestic indigenous car industry, right? No longer. It wasn't valued. It just wasn't valued. And so
it's tragic.
We don't manufacture cars anymore.
Yeah,
that was reasonably recently.
I mean, that's the big panic over the industrial ascendancy of Japan in the 80s and the Kanban revolution. It was a type of human capital, a way of doing things that created a new paradigm for manufacturing and development that the West learned probably all of the wrong lessons from. They looked at it and they were like, hyper efficient, like everything is just in time, really lean. We're going to lay everybody off. We're going to start outsourcing to contractors. And in Japan, that is not what it looked like. Countries like Japan and Korea have a totally different industrial system, whether it's Meitei or Maitai in Japan, however you want to call it, or the chaebol system in Korea. It is not like as we were saying in the US, the 1099 contractor economy that a lot of that stuff managed to make. So this is a long way around of bringing my to the next question in regards to Australia, which is, how is it possible, do you think, in the long run, to shift the understanding of economics in Australia to culturally value something like economic complexity? And if so, what do you think are the most persuasive avenues for making that type of case?
Yeah, that's a pretty good question. And I would say what makes it a little bit more complex and more difficult is that it is a long-term project. You can't have a new government come in with a head of steam and go, industrial policy, economic complexity, let's get after it, and then 3 years later be voted out. You will develop very little of value in 3 years' time. It is a cumulative process that I think would take at least a decade to even wind up to be recognizable. Crisis, in my darker moments, I think that it requires crisis of some sort. We've had COVID. We've seen what's happened to people who've had a taste of it. Even now, it's not that the shelves in the shop are bare, but there's a lot of gaps in the shelves that were never there before. So people are getting a sense that our supply chains may be in some instances too long, too unwieldy, too uncertain. If you think that's true of the supermarket, wait until you move into the industrial economy and you see what our supply chains look like. Then it's terrifying.
I mean, I have to say, like, Australia has had some of the most impressive trucking feats I've ever seen. The huge freight trucks that are almost like trains, the way that those guys can drive things almost through the wilderness, no problem, is a high level of skill, that exact type of human capital we're talking about. And the shortages of being able to get those types of truckers to commit to that supply chain, which is vital for Australia, as
Mm.
far as I can tell, is worrying to me. And I don't even live there.
Yeah, I mean, it's true. I think in terms of the distribution network within Australia and the things we produce locally, we're food self-sufficient, we're energy self-sufficient, excluding liquid fuels. So internally, it's not too bad, but that's sort of on a kind of hour by hour, day by day basis, right? But our big industrial facilities that, let's say keep the lights on, or, produce, unload ships, or, transfer liquid fuels or gas around the place, so manufacture petrochemicals, the pumps, the valves, the instrumentation, the industrial controllers, the huge range of equipment they require that needs to be repaired and replaced constantly is 100% reliant on international suppliers.
Mm,
100%. So
mm,
we operate these, and we design and operate these large, complex industrial facilities, but absolutely none of the components that go in to do that come from Australia. So we have an industrial exposure to supply chains that I think most people are ignorant of. But getting back to your question, how do you make people aware of it, and to try and, maybe change the things that people value? Pursuing economic complexity will come with additional cost, certainly in the early stages of it. There's no question of that. I mean, these long supply chains have given us very, very cheap consumer goods. So it's a difficult case to make, to say, let's understand that everything is going to cost a little bit more for an undefined period of time, until we build up these domestic capabilities. It's not even clear, and here I'm starting to sound really negative. It's not even clear that we have the human capital anymore to do this quickly and efficiently. It may
mm,
take a long time. I would say the scientific and mathematical education in Australia is not what it was 20 or 30 years ago, and
mm.
a lot of work needs to be done. We've got really smart young kids in this country. There's no shortage of them, but they're not always coming out of high school or university a really solid foundation in math and science. So it could be a long process to build up that economic complexity. But I think, I really do think the best. So this crisis can always do it, right? We don't have something, the lights are off, we can't get trucks to the supermarket because we don't have the fuel. A bit of a deep dive, a bit of soul searching, maybe that would go a long way. I'm not sure. But one other thing I think is the more aspiration aspect of economic
Mm,
complexity, which is, those jobs, well paid,
yeah,
they're rewarding
yeah.
in a way that a lot of modern jobs simply are not. And it's not just a question of pay, though that's important. It's a question of, yeah, one book I'm really fond of is Dave Graeber's, On the Rise of Bullshit Jobs.
Yeah.
And, I've worked at different parts of different industries, and, there are aspects to my own job that definitely kind of go that way from time to time. But broadly, I have a sense that what I do is useful and contributes and to the community and the society in which I live in some way. There are a lot of jobs that simply don't fall into that category, as Dave Graeber in his book points out. That is very
Mhm.
true in Australia. That is very true here. And people feel it. People, I talk to young people. I mentor a few young professionals and young engineers, and there's this sense that, studied hard for 4 years to get a engineering degree. They've come out and their job is just not as rewarding. They're not doing the difficult, complex, needle moving things that they want to do. They've become, they've gone straight into a career of, I would say, technical administration. So there's an aspirational thing there to give people more satisfaction in their jobs and more pride that they're really benefiting the community in which they live. So maybe that would be part of the sales pitch.
Yeah, no, I definitely think that there's a pervasive, sort of sense of drift that people feel
Drift,
in
good
their
word.
everyday lives. And I think that's, there's a lot to really love about what mass production and even mass consumption have brought into our lives. But one of the things that I think advocates of those things can miss, and believe me, I advocate for those things, is the idea of the dignity of work and what it means to have a job that matters, and the fact that labor is a part of being the human animal, and so much as being political is part of, or creative, or procreative, or romantic, or all of these things, that is part of the human life. And we can't live in a perfect world where every job is maximally meaningful. There will always be some level of BS, but I think we get a sense that there is a famine of meaning in our work lives, and it can't be remedied by offsets into more meaningful forms of leisure.
I agree completely.
Yeah.
I wish I could have given it those words, but yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head, Emmett.
Yeah. Thank you. I think this is where you and I are really aligned. So just to move back into nuclear a little bit, because we've panned out, and I think that's good, because focusing too much on nuclear can kind of miss the bigger societal picture of what's important about industry and energy. What's been sort of the broad strokes of how advocacy for nuclear has been moving along since you've gotten involved with it? What's going on? Just give me a rundown.
Sure. Yeah, that's a good question. I think you're probably going to force me to remember where we started and where we've got to over the last 4 years. So when the current government that is currently trying to get itself re-elected was elected three and a bit years ago, they undertook a national, I think it was actually called an inquiry, run by Standing Economics Committee or Standing Environmental and Economics Committee within the Senate, to look at what role did nuclear have in Australia's energy future. We contributed to it. Many others contributed to it. I think it was a good inquiry. Certainly the report that came out of that inquiry was encouraging. Unfortunately, it hasn't gone anywhere. The two largest states, New South Wales and Victoria, had similar inquiries around the same time. So there was these three kind of inquiries that there was a bit of a head of steam for a bit in the nuclear advocacy space, that the politicians are thinking about this. They're considering it seriously. Yeah, I would say that's petered away. There was also some interest around that time because power prices were very high. Very, very high. We went from having the cheapest electricity in the world to having some of the most expensive electricity in the world in a very short order, it must be said. I'm led to believe Australia comes in for some international criticism for being dependent on coal, but no country has spent more per capita trying to deploy solar and wind than Australia, not even Germany.
You
So
know
we've
that?
given,
That's
yeah,
wild.
per capita, we've spent more.
That's
So we've given it a
wild.
red hot crack, and we've learned a lot. Well, I don't know, maybe we haven't learned anything, but for a variety of reasons, mainly to do with the fact that we're also quite dependent now on gas as the marginal cost setter, let's say, of electricity. So that, combined with a very high penetration of renewables that were coming online, and the fact that some of our coal-fired power stations aren't being run very efficiently, they're not being run very well, they're starting to become less reliable. We had these huge power prices, and they're shutting down as well. Sorry, I should mention.
Yeah, they're retiring, right? I mean,
They're
I
actually in
know.
a race to retire. They're falling over each other, trying to retire first
Yeah,
at the moment.
we're losing, like, I don't know, like 30 gigs in the next decade of coal. It's a huge shortfall.
That's larger than Australia's entire grid. Anyway, so power price is really high, so it's topical. Well, power prices then came down a bit. International gas prices came down, and when international gas prices came down, Australian electricity prices also came down. And so, there was a collective sigh of relief. The government stopped worrying about it for a little while. Well, that's changed. So a few things have changed. One, of course, the AUKUS deal, which was announced last year, where the US and the UK would assist Australia to somehow get nuclear propelled submarines. And we did quite a bit of polling around that time to sort of get a sense of how that was changing people's attitudes towards nuclear, and at least to consider civilian nuclear energy. And it was changing them a lot. So that's shifted the needle really positively. We're going to redo that polling later this year and see if that interest has been maintained or if it's petered out. And the other thing, of course, that's happened is power prices have come back up. It was always going to happen, but this is making the advocacy a little bit more effective, I would say. So in March last year, a parliamentary friendship group of nuclear industries was started. That's been, I would say, a really good body for political engagement. You know, they're hungry for information, and many others have had the opportunity to either through Zoom or actually go to Canberra and present on different aspects of nuclear technology. So it could be the economics, it could be the regulatory environment, it could be the safeguarding, could be, you know, technical aspects. You know, there's a lot of work to do, but there is now a forum for engaging with politicians formally, and that, I think that's been really important.
Great.
And effective. But ultimately, it will come down to the political calculus, and we have to work towards a future. Advocacy has to then move out of advocacy and into something a bit more tangible. And so we, you know, getting back to that point, well, why would politicians spend the political capital if you don't have a developer lining up ready to build a nuclear power station, or at least signaling that they're going to? You know, in the absence of a credible proponent, I don't see the political calculus making sense. And so I think that's the next area of focus, is to convince a credible proponent, either in Australia, but probably in a JV with, you know, an international nuclear.
Seems like there's a deal that could be struck with somebody who's got the reps in to successfully, reliably crank out reactors. Like if I'm you guys, you know, I'm not, but if I'm you guys, I'm taking a look at Korea. I'm taking a look at various other people to see if there's some sort of partnership that can be struck to gain off of to draft off of their successes.
Yeah, and I think that's what it would take. And, you know, it's not. No one's going to come in and say, oh yeah, we'll put the money down for it, just change the law. At the very best, what you could hope for is, you know, we've done a preliminary look at what it would take. We think there's an opportunity to look at this further. You know, we think there's something there, but dear government, first you're going to need to change that law, and then we're going to spend some serious money fleshing out the concept and doing the, you know, pre-feasibility assessments and that sort of thing. So, you know, we are trying to steer advocacy in the direction of finding a credible proponent who will make it worth the politicians' while to.
Okay, well, I love that. It's a path that makes sense to me. It's better than just a hope and a prayer. It is practical, you know. And I know that I have some listeners in Australia, some with technical backgrounds. So if they wanted to reach out and figure out how to pitch in, how could they do that?
Yeah, certainly. So we're not on social media. I'll say that. You know, you and I've spoken about that previously. It's just not a space we're interested in.
Totally. Plenty of reasons not to be interested in it.
Yeah, we can't contribute in that space. But what we can do is we can leave some contact details in the show notes, and, you know, we're always thrilled to hear from people. You know, we've had people just reach out to us, cold call us, and give us some really good ideas in the past as well. So we're always looking to collaborate, and yeah, please, if any of your viewers want to, reach out. All
right, sounds wonderful, James. Thank you so much for joining me.
Emmett, thanks for having me on. It's good to talk with you again, and we're going to have one of our non-nuclear catch-ups soon.
I agree. I'd love that. I would love that. So everybody, stay sharp, stay strong, and stay radiant. We will see you next time.